The late 1860s saw a fairly radical reorganisation of the British Admiralty in terms of who had authority to do what, and as a result, construction of ironclads briefly paused. The new First Lord of the Admiralty, that's the political appointment as opposed to what we now know as the First Sea Lord, the most senior actual admiral, initiated consideration of new designs, since the two newest turret ships, HMS Monarch and the ill-fated HMS Captain, were still under construction, and not enough was known about the true properties of an ocean-going turret ironclad. As a result, a request was made to the Royal Navy's chief constructor, Edward Reed, for a small 6 to 6,500 ton ironclad armed with two large guns and a combined steam and sail rig. However, aware of previous attempts at economy ironclads, Reed noted that this would be an impractical ship for the Royal Navy, and instead submitted a somewhat larger and more powerful design, which closely resembled the latest generation of US Navy monitors, which at that point were freshly built. This alarmed the design committee, and the design would be heavily revised, after Reed's resignation in protest over the ongoing construction of HMS Captain in 1870. The design was then still further updated even as initial building work was underway. This would eventually produce two ships, HMS Devastation and HMS Thunderer, laid down in 1869, launched in 1871 and 1872 respectively, and commissioned in 1873 for Devastation, and much later in 1877 in Thunderer's case, in part due to a boiler explosion while she was on trials. The ships displaced just over 9,300 tons and could make between 13 and 14 knots from around about 6,500 indicated horsepower, which drove a pair of four-bladed screws. The two ships used two different types of engines, giving Devastation almost half a knot speed advantage over her sister, and also allowing her to carry about 200 tons more coal. Armament was quite simple. Four 12-inch guns mounted in two twin turrets, one fore, one aft, and that was it, apart from a ram. Although Devastation used 35-ton muzzle-loading rifles, whilst her sister ship used two 35-tonners and two newer 38-ton weapons, which, according to the balance of sources, were originally intended as 12.5-inch weapons, but finished with a 12-inch caliber to ensure commonality of supply for the ammunition. Originally, the plan was to use the 25-ton 12-inch guns, but the newer guns were considered more capable. The 38-ton weapons on Thunderer also had a new hydraulic loading system, but would suffer from a double loading accident resulting in the catastrophic detonation of one of the guns, wrecking the turret and hastening the adoption of the breech loading gun, which had been resisted in the Royal Navy for quite some time after problems with early breech loading weapons in the 1860s. Armour consisted of a wide variety of thicknesses, the belt being 12 inches of iron at its strongest point, with 14 inches, the maximum on the turrets, plus 3 inches of deck armour. The design was considered revolutionary in a number of ways, the most obvious being the complete abandonment of sail for the first time in a capital ship, having only a simple mast for signalling installed, and thus relying entirely on steam power if it wanted to go anywhere. For seakeeping, the forward part of the hull had a light superstructure built above the armour belt and deck. This gave a somewhat acceptable freeboard and considerably more accommodation. Aft, the superstructure had an interesting doubling back to allow for the aft turret to depress its guns fully, something that was much more important in the era of point-blank gunfights where an enemy might even be a monitor type with very little to no freeboard. The height of the turret and this significant negative elevation of the guns would allow heavy shells to be fired down through the deck of such an enemy vessel, or into the waterline if it was a more conventional ship. Crew requirements were significantly reduced thanks to the lack of sails, and the guns, having an exceptionally wide field of fire, were considerably more dangerous to the enemy than previous turret installations on Royal Navy ships. Whilst the ship's new and novel features provoked much pessimism on their entry into service, not helped by Captain's loss midway through their construction, they proved their critics mostly wrong, with specific orders to sail into the Atlantic in rough weather as soon as such conditions presented themselves, which saw Devastation perform considerably better in most weathers than the mixed propulsion ironclads that accompanied her in these endeavours. As the 1870s turned into the 1880s, the rise of the torpedo and the torpedo boat saw refits. 6 small guns were added to the superstructure, plus a Gatling gun on the mast top, along with a pair of small 14-inch torpedo launchers in the forecastle, 1 per side, and a small torpedo boat of the ship's own being added to the ship's boat collection, with Thunderer also testing out torpedo nets, which were then a new innovation. Another decade passed, and a much larger refit at the start of the 1890s replaced all the weapons. The 12-inch muzzle-loading rifles became 10-inch breech-loading rifles, and the smaller guns were replaced with 6 single 6-pounder guns and 8 single 3-pounders. The engines were replaced with vertical triple expansion models, which improved efficiency and speed. The ships were now capable of just over 14 knots, but only needed 1,200 tons of coal. A new bridge, new funnels, and new masts were also installed, with Devastation getting something the better of that, with a single mast and a built-up bridge, which looked aesthetically more pleasing, at least to my eye, than Thunderer's open bridge and second thin pole mast. The rise of the pre-dreadnoughts with the launch of HMS Majestic would see the ships reduced to port guard ships, but they would remain in service until 1907, just about managing to see HMS Dreadnought enter service before being decommissioned and eventually heading off to the breakers' yards themselves.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.